everyone, it's Patrick, and welcome back to Slice of Empathy. In the last episode, we talked about my story growing up after divorce, losing my dad at 16, moving in with my emotionally unavailable mother and a stepfather who barely spoke to me. Spent years untangling how that shaped me as a man and a husband, but today it's Valerie's turn, my wife, my best friend, and someone I've seen fight through pain and silence with more courage than anyone I know. And I'm here not just as a co-host, but as someone who loves her deeply and wants to help her share her truth in her own words.
In the last episode, we explored Patrick's quiet trauma, being raised by a single dad, losing him as a teenager, and entering a home where emotional support didn't exist. The introduction of his mom and living with his mom and his stepdad. And I think we forgot to mention in a prior episode, but you briefly encountered him at the cemetery, and he still didn't say anything to you. Can you tell us how that was or what that experience was like for you?
It's kind of awkward to say the least. I think we had gone by to visit my mother's grave, probably not too long after she had passed away. I don't remember how long it was exactly, but I remember just happening running to Rich. I was like, "Oh, Rich is here. I'll say come and just be nice and say hi." And Valerie was like, "No, screw that. I'm just gonna wait in the car." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I go up and I say hi, and this motherfucker didn't say anything. He just kind of just like just kind of grunts, doesn't say anything. Was standing there in silence, and I'm like, "Oh, all right. I guess that's how it is then." Didn't say anything else. I think I might have said bye, and then I left. And he just did not say a word. In all this time since my mom has passed away, it's been like 12 years. She still does not have a headstone, which is quite frankly insulting, especially since they're married for like 20, I think a little over 20 years. Just shake my head at the whole thing.
Yeah, I feel like that really just kind of says a lot about him and maybe about the way he handled his grief, or maybe it was ignored. But I feel like definitely at this point in time, he has since remarried and moved on. I think like probably, I want to say just under maybe 10 years ago. And it's been quite a while. And so if it had something to do with, him struggling to move on, I feel like that's one thing, but he's clearly since moved on. And I think finances aren't really it either, since it's been quite this long. But yeah, how does that like make you feel now? It's kind of like knowing that he hasn't made the effort to kind of finalize that.
It's rather insulting because I'm sure like he got money when my ex step grandmother passed away, and they sold her house and divided it in four between all the stepdad and the siblings. So there's really no reason that you can't spend, I don't know, $1,000, under $1,000 for a headstone. It's really just like, frankly, insulting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know sometimes it can take a while to get a headstone, but I think there's been more than enough time. But I want to move on to like where you are now, trying therapy for the first time in a while. I think you only maybe tried it once before for a limited amount of time. Would you say that it's helped you open up more? Do you feel like you're still kind of working through things from your childhood that weren't really previously acknowledged?
Yeah, I guess I would say it's helped me open up more. It's definitely helped talk about things that I guess I never really thought about. In a somewhat dysfunctional household with a emotionally unavailable mother and a stepdad who just didn't want to be a step parent.
And yeah, so I want to take a moment to also welcome our audience back to, I think, so like whatever, we haven't really given this a name, like kind of like the marriage podcast series, and just kind of like seeing where kind of it takes us. But this episode is going to be kind of focused on my story, but I know we had like a few loose ends to tie it from our last episode, a couple of things we didn't cover. So I'm excited about that. And, just kind of continuing this series. It seems like you guys enjoyed the last episode that we did, something that we both really enjoyed. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started.
All right. Val, you mentioned before that for a long time you didn't know you had to write what you would call, I guess, trauma. Can we start from there? What would you say your childhood was like? Not just what happened, but how it shaped you as a person.
It's really interesting because for me that it was normal for like a long time. And I remember even when I was younger, I didn't really have like friends over. I think because like inherently I felt like embarrassed about my household really and how things were. And I mean, I didn't really give it a lot of thought then, but I think I kind of inherently knew. But I guess at the same time, still to me, that was normal. So I didn't really know what normal exactly kind of like looked like. But it was very much built on fear and chaos. You couldn't really speak up about anything really. Otherwise, it was kind of seen as like an act of defiance. We kind of go back to like, kids are seen and not heard, like that kind of age old analogy. And so you just inherently learn to kind of be that, to kind of go along with things, to not really voice how you feel about certain things, or really, I guess, in a way, get in the way. So there was a lot of like suppressed emotions that I felt like kind of took into my adult life, into our marriage. And that's really because there were like consequences of speaking up. And I feel like that's hard for so many people to unlearn as they get older because you're afraid of what's going to happen. And I think even now, I think it's something like when we talk about like people pleasing, we're afraid of sometimes like saying no, or we're afraid of how that other person is going to react, or in a way, if we're going to disappoint them, make them upset. We're afraid of that other person's reactions, which now, as you get older, hopefully you'll learn that the other person's reaction is really their responsibility to manage and it's not your responsibility. But when you're in a chaotic, dysfunctional environment, you learn at the time that you're responsible for your parents' maybe outbursts or dysfunctional behaviors, abuse. So you are making the connection that or feel that you're responsible for it. So many people will ultimately take that into their adult lives. And so basically you learn to minimize your own needs in order to keep a calm, not necessarily happy, but, an environment where you'll feel safe.
Okay. Do you remember the first time you realized something wasn't normal about your home?
No, it's really hard because my early memories of a lot of things are very fuzzy, but I always just kind of had this lingering feeling that I was like, just like different and kind of like an outcast in a way, like different from my peers with a different home life. I mean, hence why I didn't really have like friends over or anything like that. But I think underneath, like feeling like, oh, there was something wrong with me, I kind of knew that there was something wasn't right about like the way I was being treated. Things just didn't seem, for example, like punishments for certain things just didn't really seem to fit the crime. Like one year I remember like our Christmas presents were taken away. And honestly, I don't even remember the reason. I don't remember the reason why. And I feel like, again, it's like one instance because I'm like, if there was a huge thing that you did that warranted that, like that would be something that you remember. But the fact that I don't remember why, I feel like kind of speaks volumes.
You left home at 18, which is, a big deal. What did it take to walk away, or what was the reason that made you want to move out at 18, and what stayed with you anyway?
Yeah, and it's like this is a conversation I come back to like many, many times and a time again. I felt like I was kind of pushed to. I think I felt like for so many years that I needed to get out of a chaotic, abusive environment. And I didn't feel physically or emotionally safe in my home. And even though that later led to financial struggles, I felt like that was the best idea at that time, for safety, emotionally and physically. And it was really hard. I think I just left, really. I think we were staying in an apartment temporarily at the time because of construction on my house growing up. And so there's like, partially, I was already partially moved out anyway. I had things stored at my grandmother's house. And so at that point in time, I basically just didn't come back the night I turned 18. And I text my dad that basically I'm 18 now, I'm not coming back. And he actually didn't even respond. And I kind of like look back on that and just like, it's almost like I didn't even believe that was going to turn out the way that it did. But I mean, I wish things could have been different. I mean, my dad had told me when I was younger, oh, well, you should have stayed home and focused on school and you wouldn't have to struggle financially. But I felt like I had to, like I felt pushed out because I wasn't safe. And it was almost like kind of gaslighting in a way, I felt like, because like to me, there wasn't really any other option. If there was, if it was like, wasn't a normal environment, then yeah, sure. I wouldn't have left at 18, but I feel like anyone who has been in this situation, there's usually a very good reason why that you need to leave. And I mean, I think that was the best decision at that time. There probably wasn't really any changing that, even though it was years to come, a real financial struggle.
All right. So when we first got together, I saw you as a strong and independent person, kind of person who handles things. But now we both know what kind of strength can come from pain and trauma. What were some patterns you didn't realize were connected to your past?
I think it was a lot of manipulation, a lot of control, hypervigilance on my part, which I think is really common for a lot of like trauma survivors, especially like growing up in a house like that. I think struggles with trust, really. I think even like leading into our relationship, I still kind of had this mentality of like strangers, just you can't trust anybody. Like you can't trust anybody. And it was like very simple things. And it's just like, oh, is this guy like gonna do something to me? Like there was a lot of like fear and anxiety when it comes to like other people and not really knowing how to navigate conflict appropriately because conflict and growing up for me was basically yelling and screaming, hitting, all that stuff. That's basically how we were taught to problem solve. And then something that I feel like has been a struggle for me over many years is over functioning in the relationship, overperforming because it's like your output is tied to or feeling like your output is tied to your inherent worth. Because I was very much like, for me, growing up, feeling like I had to, like, for example, get like A's and B's in order to get praise and love. And so I think a lot of people like myself kind of tend to take that into relationships, just feeling like you have to constantly produce, be the perfect partner, be the perfect wife in order to satisfy the other person.
Let's see. Were there moments where my tone or action reminded you of something, even if I, unintentionally wasn't trying to hurt you?
Yeah, I think for me, that come to mind really are like when you've raised your voice at me or yelled at me. That was something, even in the past, like that's something that would kind of take me back to like when my dad would do it because it was his way of gaining control and getting us to back into a corner in a way. And so sometimes it would bring up parts of me that were very reactive. So as I mentioned that in my house, problem solving was yelling, hitting, screaming. And so, this is where we go back to the early parts of our relationship that were very toxic because there was a lot of that happened because I was reacting at home to abuse essentially.
And how did you realize that those reactions weren't really about us, but more along the lines about younger versions of you that you were still trying to stay safe?
I'd say probably within the last 5 or 10 years, so a little bit more recently. I mean, I'm 36 now. This goes my childhood, like when I left at 18, that's, so many years removed. But I'd say probably within the last 5 to 10 years was really when I realized that it would bring me back to a time where I didn't feel safe or I was shaking. I want to say probably when you were doing Uber and Lyft full time and we thought we might get divorced. And it kind of brings me back to that time because I just felt like I didn't know what to do. And that was a very difficult time. And that's kind of what it really kind of brought me back to was thinking like, oh, like this reminds me of like when I was a kid and my dad yelling at me. But really, it wasn't just about what you said or did. It just really made me just think about all those times that I wasn't really seen or heard as a kid.
So, something we've talked about ad nauseum since we were both raised by single dads, which is kind of rare because a lot of times kids are raised by their moms. So, again, it give us this, I guess, shared toughness, maybe, or maybe this shield we use. Do you think we fell in love with each other's armor a little bit, just like our similarities?
Yeah, it's really interesting because in a way I felt like at the time I didn't realize that you had really had your own trauma. And I think you weren't aware of that at the time also. So it's really hard to say because I felt like we were almost kind of opposites in a way because like for example, I was very guarded and kind of closed off and like you were still even at that time like having a parent who was emotionally unavailable, still affectionate and huggy whereas like even now sometimes I still like struggle with that. I feel like a lot of it is like I feel like okay, society tells me I need to hug people, and so I'm trying to find some sort of balance because like part of me wants to, but then sometimes I'm not entirely sure if the other person does and trying to find like the sort of balance. It's interesting because I kind of felt like at that time you were like protective of me and kind to me. And that's definitely not something I was used to, especially from the men in my life. And I think that was something that really kind of stuck out to me as just something different. I guess I didn't even think about it because when you hear of trauma bond, like you would, I don't know if like we would be considered trauma bonding, but that's something that you kind of hear like more nowadays. But basically, it kind of refers to people who kind of cling to each other in turbulent times and like for survival. I don't know if that necessarily was the case for us because I feel like your trauma didn't really come out until later. But I know for myself, like I was afraid to be vulnerable to being needy or being needed in a way.
How would you say your childhood shaped your boundaries and your emotional language?
It's really interesting. This is a conversation I have often because I didn't even know what boundaries were until I had a therapist bring them up in a counseling session. I think I was maybe like 16 or 17 when I had a therapist said that, or had a therapist say that basically boundaries are non existent in my family. And at that time, I didn't know what that meant, but I sure as hell do now. But at that time, I'm like, I didn't know what that meant. I mean, of course, she explained it to me and all of that, but I was just like, well, what's that? And I feel like that little kids, I think with proper parenting, should be learning like how to voice their needs. But basically, we did, many people, I feel like, especially like Gen X and like millennials, were still like kind of coming out of that seen and not heard era. So I think because of that, I never learned to advocate for myself. And I want to say that there is some irony in this because I remember there was this high school project, group projects, not my favorite thing. And even though I showed up each day to the group project, I wasn't given anything to do. But somehow some of my teammates ranked me very low. And I think I got like a D or something in that class. And my dad was really upset. And so basically, he wanted me to go and advocate for myself to the teacher to try and somehow make this. I mean, long story short, I ended up making this up, just doing a group or a solo project over the summer, which wasn't fun. But like, I look back on that now and I'm like, well, how can you expect your kids to advocate for themselves if you're not teaching them to do that at home? Because basically the opposite of that is what is promoted, basically like backing down, being submissive. So how can you expect your kids to have these skills? And so that's something that I come back to often. And it's like so many people out there, I didn't have these skills at that time. It's something that I had to learn to develop in my adult years by necessity for survival. And that's not something I recommend. I feel like that's something like, the parent's job is everyone should have their own personal boundaries in the home and communicate their needs. But yeah, that's kind of how it was for me.
And then were there moments when you realized you were protecting yourself from me, even when I was trying to get closer with you?
Yeah. At the time, I felt like kind of guarded, sharing a lot about my family. But honestly, I felt like I think I shared more about myself than I intended with you. And I was like surprised by like your very quick acceptance, And this was like really surprising because I kind of felt like throughout my life that I couldn't be myself or couldn't be my full self without pushing people away. And it's harder to find a specific moment, but that's kind of like something that I think about often. And I think that's kind of why you mentioned like I'm not as quite physically affectionate as you are. I think that's part of that. And I think really that's the biggest thing is just like protecting myself. And I think like, even it's hard for me to even give you pet names. It's like, I don't know. It's just, that's not even, I think for anyone really, I just usually call people by their names. And so it's like, I think it might sound silly, but like the implication of a pet name, it's this indicator of like this closeness, right? Like closeness meaning additional vulnerability. And that has been hard for me.
All right, let's talk about healing. What made you finally decide to go deeper into therapy or revisit what you've been trying to avoid?
Yeah. So I actually kind of took a break from therapy between maybe when I was in my early 20s until COVID hit. Because I've been like in therapy off and on throughout most of my life, throughout my childhood, early adulthood. But I think also there were finances involved, and I want to just make it clear that I understand that like therapy is a privilege for so many people, and many people can't afford it or you don't have insurance coverage that, is sufficient enough to cover it. And I think for me that, was very much the case for so many years, which was part of it. So I want to say there may have been like something close to like 5 to 10 years where I wasn't in therapy and then I started to go back into therapy. I want to say around COVID, so like 2020, 21. With everything going on, I think many people needed therapy, obviously. And that was really hard because I had to find a new therapist and everything was so backlogged because of COVID. There's, so many people like getting therapy and finding a therapist was rather challenging during that time. I mean, I had insurance coverage and everything, but trying to go be referred to a provider and then find a provider with availability was rather challenging. But I think really because of that, COVID kind of spurred that. But actually, I know we did do couples therapy.
Did not go over well.
Yeah, briefly in 2017. We had a few sessions. But other than that, like as far as individual therapy, it had been a while. We did do couples therapy briefly when we were having some challenging times. And after the first couple of sessions, it seemed to go really well. And then a really hard subject came up. And then I remember you walked out of the room and I just felt like I didn't know, like, where do we go from here? Like, I just didn't know what to do. Does this mean that this is done? Like, we're getting a divorce? But I also felt like extreme embarrassment. Can you tell us what this was like for you or what was going through your head at the time?
be honest, I don't even remember what it was. It was just maybe it was something that we hadn't talked about. Because my own counselor says that it's better to do couples therapy when things are going well than when they're going bad. So you kind of head it off, so to speak. Try to address it before it turns into a big blow up. I don't know, something that just made me really pissed off, and I left. So we can laugh about it a tiny bit now, but like at the time
Yeah.
wasn't not something that to laugh about.
Yeah, I just remember at that time just feeling like almost resentful in a way and just like, well, how dare you embarrass me like this? But then I remember the counselor saying that like I had to decide like where we go from here, which I didn't even know what that meant. I just felt like I couldn't show my face in there again. And so 3 years later, COVID hit and I was just in a very dark place again. I'm like, okay, I probably should at least go back for individual therapy. And so I've kind of been there like kind of ever since. And I feel like it was for the best, even if it's like every 2 weeks, once a month. Like as you were saying, so many people are getting therapy even when things are going well. I mean, because like maybe you have a day or you go through a season that comes up and that's really difficult because life isn't perfect. And so it just like kind of having that pocketbook, so to speak, it's just been beneficial. Even when you do feel like things are going well, there will inevitably be things that come up. And I think that, the stigma on therapy is lessened to a degree where like you're hearing like so many people have like a therapist and they're just like your coworker or just like, people just going about their day. Like, and it's just like, what? You have a therapist? And it's just, so that stigma has really been kind of lessened. And I think that's really been great. And it's been great for me to kind of get through difficult seasons.
Was there a moment that you felt that clicked where you feel like you knew things had to change?
I think like during the time that like I had therapy, I mean, like for sure, like when I left home at 18, I was in therapy for several years because of that. And I think it took a while to really fully process that, like what had happened to me, because I felt like so many people, you kind of like try to like move forward. And, a year after that, we got married and like we're also in school. And so we had all these things going on simultaneously. And I think I've mentioned this before in previous episodes. If I could go back and do things differently, I would take a year off of college because I think I needed that time to really fully process, like at least that last year before I moved out was extremely chaotic and abusive, to really fully process what happened to me because it did take a little bit longer for me to get through school. I mean, it wasn't like too terribly much longer. It did ultimately take 6 years for me to get my bachelor's degree, versus like the typical 4. But then, you also have the typical, figuring out what major you want to do. And so that adds time. You take classes. We went to community college, trying to figure those things out. So honestly, I may have been just better off taking a year off instead of immediately going to college.
What did healing allow you to do different, like say in our marriage, especially when I was going through my own?
I think healing, especially over the years, has allowed me to heal in the way to where I can be fully present for you. I mean, I think we've talked about this before where like especially like when your mom was going through like her cancer treatments and then of course like when she passed away and going through all that, I felt like there were definitely moments where I could have been fully present and I kind of like regret not having the emotional capacity to do that at the time. There were definite moments where I felt like, yeah, I could have definitely done that differently. So, like healing now, I feel like in healing myself, it's kind of like you go back to the airplane analogy to where you can't really fully help someone until you take care of yourself first. And I think that's where it really kind of comes in because you really do have to take care of yourself to be fully present for someone else. So I feel like I'm at a point to where I can, fully do that. So really healing just kind of made space for me to kind of help you throughout like some of the difficulties that we've had, especially within the last 5 years or so. I could really show up fully. without just kind of being in the background during the process.
And say healing isn't a straight line. There's ups and downs. So we both know that. What does it look like for you today?
I think some days still feel hard. I mean, I think, when you have something like depression or anxiety, it's like never fully gone. So there's like definitely still days where I'm kind of feeling like it, or just the day just feels hard, or I just feel kind of down. But I don't necessarily like feel shame about it. And it's just really an invitation for me to really give some insight into like what it is that I need to do or change in that moment. And I feel like I'm more aware of like what my needs are than I was previously, or what I need to like feel better when I do have those moments of lows. But I feel like I'm more readily able to be like open about like what I'm going through if I'm having a difficult day, and asking for what it is that I need, and just feeling more connected, because I feel like there's more like truth between us. Like if like, for example, I have like a really bad headache, or I'm just not feeling well, say asking you to like cook dinner, or just, take on something that I'm just like, I just can't do this today. If I'm having a day like that, and just kind of like keeping that communication open.
So in the future, what would you want our kid to know about emotions, safety, and love that we didn't get? And what would you say to someone who's listening who's still stuck in survival mode?
I think it's important for kids to really know from a fairly early on, like young age. I see people like all the time having kids identify their emotions like fairly early on, like I'm 4 or 5 years old, maybe even younger if, they're able to really identify like what it is that they're feeling, and like naming that feeling if they're able to, and to associate it. And so I feel like that kind of gets the ball rolling, and being able to like, have a conversation about like why it is that they're feeling that way. Because I think we give kids less credit than they're due, really, because they are highly perceptive and more aware than we think they are about things that are going on. And I think it's a missed opportunity, really, to really have those conversations. And I think so many of like the previous generations was very much just like, again, the kids are seen and not heard, and you just don't really talk about things like that. People just like, oh, kids are too young, they don't know any better, like, and they just don't have those conversations. When in reality, I think young children are at least able to kind of say, oh, well, I'm sad. And then, like, okay, why are you feeling sad? And, kind of take the conversation from there. And, I think like, again, when it comes to like, say, physical affection, many of the previous generations, like, oh, you just go, you hug and kiss, say, Uncle Jerry or something when you see him, right? It's just like a societal norm. Oh, you go and give grandma a hug and kiss or whatever it is. And so, for example, maybe if your child isn't comfortable with doing that, I think a lot of times there's usually a reason. And I think that's something that parents need to be perceptive to and like aware about. I mean, I think kids usually are excited to see their family members, but I feel like when it comes to like things that are a little bit more intimate, like, hugs and kisses and things like that, to let the child kind of lead what they feel comfortable with. So I think that's something that's really important, to feel safety and love, and to really keep that conversation open so your child can feel like they're comfortable telling you when something is wrong. Because like for much of like the way I was raised, and probably many of our listeners can relate to, is that you can't really talk about a lot of these things. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, if there is something that happens to a child at school, a lot of times they won't tell their parents because like they're afraid of maybe how the parent might react, or they're afraid that they're not going to be listened to or not going to be believed or things like that. So I feel like it's just really important to keep the conversation open, even when what they might have to say might be really scary, in order for your kids to feel comfortable talking to you. And so honestly, I think for someone who is still in survival mode, I would say, and it's really hard, but to really try and slow down and listen to like whatever it is that you're feeling. Because I think for so many people, their coping mechanisms, a lot of times you'll see people as workaholics or they're like constantly on the go to avoid being quiet with their own thoughts. And so you continuously go because you aren't capable of processing those thoughts. And it's really important that we are able to do that instead of trying to like escape or, in other words, being stuck in survival mode. But yeah, I think that's really a good segue into some of our closing thoughts for some of our listeners who, have gone through a similar experience, or maybe you are currently going, through your healing journey. I just want to take a moment and let you know that you're not broken because you needed love, clarity, or care that you didn't get. And you're not dramatic because you still think about it. Like, it's still inherently part of us and it can come up at any point in our lives. You're human and your story matters too. So even if the parts that you had to keep quiet in order to survive, it still matters no matter like what age you are. And I highly encourage you, if you are able to do so, to talk to someone. There's also like, there's groups, if therapy like cost is an issue, there are support groups and things like that you can seek, self-help books. That's something that I have really kind of like leaned into. I think there was one book that was called Drama Free, and it really spoke to me in terms of like the chaos in my own family and kind of like how to navigate that and step away from it. But I'll link those all in the show notes, some helpful resources if you are looking for those. But thank you guys so much for listening and being with us on this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you enjoyed being on this podcast.
Of course, hon. I thought it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Glad you could have me. And then, hopefully a future episode, we could, I don't know, talk about something fun, like things we're currently doing that, we enjoy doing, like camping and going on vacation, traveling and whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is definitely like something that I feel like we kind of bond over. I mean, we do have a Truck Camping and Travels YouTube channel, so we are doing that as well. If you guys want to check that out, I'll also put that down in the show notes. But until next time, thanks so much for listening, and we'll definitely be back soon.